The rifle hit the dust before Colt McCade even realized he'd dropped it. 34 years of never running, never caring, never letting anyone close enough to matter, all of it shattered by 4 words from a blood-stained boy. "She's not breathing," the child had whispered, and something ancient and buried clawed its way up through Colt's chest. His boots were already moving, kicking up clouds of desert dust as the sun bled orange across the Pecos Valley. Behind him, his rifle lay forgotten like a discarded piece of his former self. The boy appeared like a ghost against the dying light, his bare feet silent on the hard-pan earth. Colt had been watering his horse at the creek when the small figure emerged from the mesquite brush, moving with the desperate urgency of something hunted. Blood streaked the child's palms and forearms, dark against his sun-weathered skin, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much for his 9 years. The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Colt's hand had instinctively moved to his rifle, a gesture as natural as breathing after decades of survival in this unforgiving land. But something in the boy's face stopped him cold, not fear, but a kind of terrible hope that made Colt's chest tighten with an emotion he'd thought long dead. The child's lips moved soundlessly at first, as if the words were too heavy to carry, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked like dry timber. "Mister," he whispered, and the single word carried the weight of a prayer. The boy stepped closer, his small hands reaching out to clutch at Colt's dusty coat, with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. There was something in his touch that cut through every wall Colt had built around his heart, something that spoke of innocence shattered and hope hanging by the thinnest of threads. The child's breath came in short, panicked gasps, and Colt could see the effort it took for him to form the words that would change everything between them. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain, but all Colt could focus on was the boy's face. "She's not breathing," the child said, and the words hit Colt like a physical blow. In that moment, 34 years of careful isolation crumbled like a dam, bursting under pressure. The rifle slipped from his fingers without conscious thought, hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo across the valley. His body moved before his mind could catch up, muscles responding to some primal instinct that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with the desperate need to act, to save, to matter, in a way he'd forgotten was possible. The boy turned and began running back toward the brush, his small legs pumping with desperate energy. Colt followed without hesitation, his longer stride quickly closing the distance between them as they crashed through the thorny undergrowth. Branches tore at his clothes and scratched his face, but he barely noticed, his entire being focused on the small figure ahead of him. The boy's ragged breathing and the sound of their footsteps on the rocky ground created a rhythm of urgency that drove them both forward through the gathering darkness. Behind them, the creek continued its eternal song, and Colt's abandoned rifle lay in the dust like a monument to the man he used to be. The transformation had taken less than a minute, but Colt knew with absolute certainty that there would be no going back. Whatever lay ahead in the mesquite brush, whatever tragedy had put that look of desperate hope in the boy's eyes, it had already claimed him as surely as if he'd signed his name in blood. They ran through a landscape painted in shades of amber and shadow, the boy's bare feet finding purchase on ground that would have challenged a seasoned tracker. Colt's boots thundered behind him, each step driving him further from the careful solitude he'd cultivated like a garden of thorns. The child moved with the fluid grace of someone born to this harsh country, ducking under low branches and leaping over fallen logs with an economy of motion that spoke of countless hours spent navigating these hidden paths. Sweat beaded on Colt's forehead despite the cooling air, not from exertion, but from the terrible anticipation building in his chest. The boy led him deeper into a maze of arroyos and hidden valleys that Colt had never known existed, despite years of riding this territory. Here, the desert revealed its secret face, Small springs that fed patches of green grass, ancient cottonwoods that had somehow found enough water to grow tall and proud, and rock formations that created natural shelters from the wind and sun. It was a place where someone could hide, could build a life away from the prying eyes of civilization, and Colt began to understand that this child was leading him home to something precious and fragile. The sound of their breathing filled the air between them, harsh and rhythmic, punctuated by the boy's occasional sob. Colt wanted to call out, to ask questions, to understand what they were racing toward, but something in the child's posture told him that words would only slow them down. Instead, he focused on keeping pace, on being ready for whatever they would find at the end of this desperate journey. The boy's small frame seemed to carry a burden far too heavy for his years, and with each step, Colt felt that burden transferring to his own shoulders. They crested a small rise, and below them lay a hidden valley no bigger than a homestead plot. A small adobe house sat nestled against the far wall of the canyon, its walls the color of dried earth, and its roof sagging with age. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney at this hour, but the air above the house remained still and empty. A vegetable garden struggled in the sandy soil beside the dwelling, and a few scraggly chickens pecked at the ground near a makeshift coop. It was a place that spoke of hard-won survival and quiet dignity, and Colt's heart clenched at the thought of what tragedy might have befallen its inhabitants. The boy stumbled as they descended into the valley, his strength finally beginning to fail him after the desperate run. Colt caught him before he could fall, his large hands gentle on the child's thin shoulders, and for a moment they stood together in the gathering dusk. The boy looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge, too much pain, and Colt saw himself reflected there, not the hardened gunman he'd become, but the man he might have been if life had dealt him different cards. "She's in there," the boy whispered, pointing toward the adobe house with a trembling finger. Colt lifted the child in his arms, feeling the boy's weight settle against his chest like a trust he'd never expected to carry. The small body was warm and solid, real in a way that cut through years of emotional numbness, and as they approached the house, Colt found himself whispering words of comfort he didn't know he still remembered. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see the flickering light of a single candle casting dancing shadows on the walls within. The woman lay still as carved stone, her chest barely rising beneath a patchwork quilt that had seen too many winters. Her face, pale as desert bone, held the kind of beauty that spoke of better days, days when laughter filled this cabin and hope wasn't such a fragile thing. Colt's boots echoed against the rough wooden floor as he crossed the threshold, his shadow falling across her motionless form like a dark prayer. The boy pressed himself against the far wall, his small frame trembling with the weight of secrets too heavy for such young shoulders. Candle wax had pooled on the bedside table, forming small mountains of grief that spoke of long nights spent in vigil. The air hung thick with the scent of sage and something else, something that made Colt's throat tighten with recognition. He knelt beside the bed, his calloused hands hovering over her wrist like a man afraid to disturb the dead. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips, weak as a butterfly's wing, but undeniably present. The relief that washed over him was so sudden, so complete, that he had to steady himself against the bed frame. Behind him, Eli's breathing came in short, desperate gasps, each exhale carrying the weight of a child who had been holding his breath for far too long. The woman's lips were cracked and dry, her skin burning with fever that seemed to radiate from her very bones. Colt had seen this before, the slow consumption that ate away at the strong until they became shadows of themselves. His own mother had wasted away in much the same manner, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her voice and the bitter taste of helplessness. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile thread still tethered her to this world. Eli's eyes darted between his mother and the stranger, who had appeared like an answer to prayers he'd been too afraid to voice. The boy's hands were stained with something dark, blood or dirt, Colt couldn't tell in the dim light, and his clothes hung on his small frame like borrowed sorrow. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with the weight of confession. 3 days, maybe 4. I lost count. The admission hung between them like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Colt felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the iron bands he'd wrapped around his heart years ago. This wasn't his fight, wasn't his burden to bear, yet here he was, kneeling beside a stranger's deathbed while a frightened child watched his world crumble. The cabin told its own story in the details Colt's trained eye couldn't ignore. The empty water bucket by the door, the cold ashes in the fireplace, the way dust motes danced in the candlelight like tiny spirits seeking escape. This was a home that had been slowly dying, one day at a time, one missed meal at a time, one unanswered prayer at a time. The boy had been fighting this battle alone, a 9-year-old soldier in a war he couldn't possibly win. Colt's jaw tightened as he recognized the familiar taste of rage. Not at the boy, not at the woman, but at the cruel indifference of a world that would leave a child to face such darkness without so much as a guiding star. He had sworn long ago never to let himself care this much again, never to let another person's pain become his own. Yet here he was, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like an old coat he'd thought he'd burned years ago. "She needs water," he said, rising to his feet with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to action. "And medicine. There's a doctor in Pecos, but that's a hard day's ride." The words felt strange in his mouth, planning, hoping, caring about outcomes beyond his own survival. Eli's eyes widened with something that might have been hope, and Colt felt his resolve crystallize like morning frost. He moved toward his saddlebags with purpose, his mind already calculating distances, supplies, possibilities. The boy followed his every movement with the desperate attention of someone watching their last chance walk away. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending tumbleweeds dancing across the yard like ghosts of better times. The sound reminded Colt of all the nights he'd spent alone under the stars, telling himself that solitude was strength, that caring was weakness. But as he turned back toward the bed, toward the woman whose breath came in shallow whispers, and the boy whose world balanced on the edge of a knife, Colt McCade felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the terrifying, exhilarating weight of purpose. The rifle he'd dropped outside seemed like a relic from another life, another man who had believed that the only way to survive was to keep moving, keep running, keep the world at arm's length. Now, standing in this humble cabin with death lurking in the shadows and hope flickering like candlelight, he understood that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was stop running and plant his feet firmly in someone else's storm. The boy's eyes met his across the dim room, and in that gaze, Colt saw his own reflection transformed. No longer the lone wolf, but something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable, a man with something to lose. Colt worked through the night with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that hope was built one small action at a time. He coaxed water between the woman's cracked lips, drop by precious drop, while Eli watched from his corner like a sentinel guarding the last treasure in a ransacked kingdom. The fever broke just before dawn, her breathing deepening into something that resembled actual sleep rather than the shallow gasps that had haunted the cabin for days. When her eyes finally fluttered open, they held the confused clarity of someone returning from a very long journey. Colt felt his own breath catch in his throat as she focused on his face, her gaze moving from surprise to gratitude to something deeper, a recognition that transcended words. The boy rushed to her side, his small hands finding hers with the desperate relief of a drowning man grasping solid ground. "Mama," Eli whispered, and the word carried the weight of every prayer he'd whispered into the darkness, every tear he'd shed in silence, every moment he'd believed he might lose the only person in the world who knew his name. She squeezed his fingers with strength that seemed impossible given her condition, and Colt watched the reunion with the awkward tenderness of a man unaccustomed to witnessing such raw emotion. He had forgotten what it looked like when love won, when the universe bent just enough to allow grace to slip through the cracks. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Who?" But her eyes remained fixed on Colt's face, and he saw in them the same question that had been haunting him since he'd first heard the boy's desperate plea. Who was he to these people? Who had he become in the space of a single night? The morning light streaming through the cabin's single window revealed details that the candlelight had mercifully hidden. The woman's hollow cheeks, the boy's too thin frame, the empty shelves that spoke of meals skipped and hope deferred. Colt's practical mind catalogued their needs with the efficiency of a man accustomed to survival. Food, medicine, firewood, and time. Precious time for healing that this harsh land rarely granted. He moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, building up the fire, preparing what little food remained in their stores, creating the small comforts that might help tip the scales toward recovery. The woman, Sarah. The boy had whispered her name like a sacred thing, watched his movements with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how a stranger had become their salvation. Her gratitude was a tangible thing, filling the spaces between them like morning mist. "You don't have to stay," she said when he brought her a cup of weak broth, though her voice carried the hope that he would ignore her words entirely. Colt paused in his ministrations, feeling the familiar tug of the horizon, the call of the open trail that had been his companion for so many years. His horse waited outside, saddled and ready, pointing toward a dozen different destinations where a man could lose himself in the vastness of the territory. But when he looked at Eli, saw the way the boy's eyes held both gratitude and the terrible knowledge that good things never lasted, Colt felt something shift permanently inside his chest. The wanderer in him, the part that had kept him moving for years, seemed to settle into stillness like dust after a storm. This cabin, these people, this moment, they had become his anchor in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I'll stay until you're stronger," he heard himself say, and the words felt like a vow spoken in a church he'd never entered. Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she was too weak to shed, and Eli's face transformed with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. Colt turned away, ostensibly to tend the fire, but really to hide the way his own composure threatened to crack. He had spent years building walls around his heart, constructing elaborate defenses against exactly this kind of entanglement. Yet here he was, voluntarily walking into the very trap he'd spent his adult life avoiding. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had run from every emotional attachment had finally been stopped in his tracks by a 9-year-old boy's desperate whisper. Outside, his horse nickered softly, as if sensing the change in the wind, the shift from temporary shelter to something approaching home. As the day wore on, Colt found himself settling into rhythms he'd forgotten he knew, the domestic choreography of caring for others, the quiet satisfaction of useful work, the way time moved differently when it was measured not in miles, traveled but in small improvements, tiny victories against the darkness. Sarah slept more peacefully than she had in days, her breathing steady and strong. Eli helped with the chores, his movements lighter now that the terrible weight of solitary responsibility had been lifted from his young shoulders. And Colt McCade, the man who had sworn never to look back, found himself planning not just for the next day, but for the days beyond that. A future that stretched ahead like an uncharted territory, dangerous and beautiful and utterly worth exploring. The rifle still lay where he'd dropped it, forgotten in the dust, while inside the cabin something far more powerful than any weapon was taking root. The radical, transformative act of choosing to stay. 3 days passed before Sarah's fever broke, and when it did, she opened her eyes to find a stranger sitting vigil beside her bed, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Colt had not moved from that chair, except to tend the fire or fetch water from the well, his rifle leaning forgotten against the far wall. Eli slept curled against his mother's side like a faithful dog, his small fingers still clutching the edge of her quilt. The sight of them together, woman, child, and the man who had chosen to stay, created something Colt had never believed possible: the architecture of home. When Sarah was strong enough to sit up and take broth, she asked him why he had remained, why a drifter would anchor himself to strangers' troubles. Colt looked out the window at the endless expanse of desert, at the horizon that had always called to him like a siren's song, and found that for the first time in his adult life, he had no desire to answer its call. "Sometimes a man finds what he's been running from," he said simply, his voice rough with unspoken truths. "And sometimes what he's been running from turns out to be what he's been running toward all along." The ranch needed work. Fences mended, cattle gathered, 100 small repairs that spoke of a woman trying to hold a life together with determination and prayer alone. Colt's hands, so long accustomed to the weight of weapons, learned the different heft of hammer and nail, the satisfaction of building rather than destroying. Eli followed him everywhere, chattering about everything and nothing, his earlier terror replaced by the boundless curiosity of childhood restored. The boy's laughter became the soundtrack of Colt's days, a melody he had never known he was hungry to hear. As autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Colt realized he had stopped counting the days since he had arrived, stopped marking time by the rhythm of departure. His horse, once restless in the makeshift corral, had settled into the easy contentment of a creature that knows it has found its place. The rifle that had been his constant companion now gathered dust above the mantelpiece, replaced by the tools of a different kind of survival, one measured not in quick draws and faster horses, but in the slow, steady accumulation of ordinary moments that somehow added up to extraordinary grace. On the first anniversary of the night Eli had grabbed his coat and whispered those life-changing words, Colt stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of fire and gold. Sarah emerged from the house, her hand finding his with the easy intimacy of shared seasons, while Eli chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. The horizon still stretched endlessly before them, vast and full of possibility, but Colt no longer felt its pull as a call to escape. Instead, he saw it as a promise that some journeys end not in distant places, but in the radical act of finally, completely coming home.